Finding ways to be financially savvy is a smart move, and knowing you could be saving money for the things you really want, like that dream home or new ride, is a great feeling. That's why the State Farm Personal Price Plan can help you save when you choose to bundle home and auto. Bundling, just another way to save with the Personal Price Plan. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
Pros, just because something on the job runs out doesn't mean you have to. Order it on the Lowe's app. My Lowe's Pro Rewards members get free same-day delivery on eligible orders over $25. Get the fasteners, hardware, or tools you need to keep the job moving. Order by 2 p.m. and get eligible in-stock items delivered right to your job site by 8 p.m. Members get more at Lowe's. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Subject to availability. Restrictions and terms at lowes.com/shipping terms. Subject to change.
In September of 1982, 12-year-old paperboy Johnny Gosch disappeared. Plucked off the street in the early morning hours and in the early portion of his paper route. Paperboys were not safe in Des Moines, Iowa, and months later, almost exactly 1 year later, another kid vanished from another street. This time, it was in a suburb of Omaha, Nebraska. He was the next paperboy. 13-year-old Danny Joe Eberle vanished from his paper route on a Sunday in September under very similar, eerily similar circumstances. He was carrying the Omaha World Herald. For 65 cents, you can read all the news that the paperboy can deliver, or for the price of a broken heart and an empty home, you can stand by the window watching the street and wondering why your little paperboy never came home. This is True Crime Garage, and this is our look at the missing paperboys, Chapter 2, Nebraska Nightmare.
We started off chapter 1 by talking about the case of Danny Joe Eberle. So let's go back to the 18th of September, 1983, Bellevue, Nebraska, just south of Omaha, Nebraska. And that September day in 1983 was in fact a Sunday when 13-year-old Danny Joe Eberle got up early. He headed down to a nearby convenience store to pick up his supply of Sunday newspapers to be delivered. He rolled the papers and he put the entire load in a delivery bag, and on his bicycle, he went off to get to his route to make the first delivery. What we would later learn, Captain, is that this boy only made 3 stops on that delivery. When some people on that route didn't receive their papers, they started calling Danny's parents home. And after receiving more than one call, his parents headed out to the route to look for Danny, finding his bike inside a gated yard. So inside the gate of a fence of a home on his paper route. Now they find his bicycle, they find his newspaper delivery bag with a bunch of papers still stuffed inside. But Danny Joe was nowhere to be found. His parents drove along the route. They drove beyond the route, hoping to find their son, but they could not. And they very quickly called the Bellevue Police Department, and a search began for the boy right away. So that's a little bit of a difference here between these two cases. But as said, things that were put into place shortly after the time that somebody like Johnny Gosch went missing, and there were others too, unfortunately, that there were grieving parents who had been fighting to change the way that law enforcement receive and react to a missing child call.
Yeah, this is something that families are still fighting for to this day.
And we talked about as well those families meeting with people in power, especially at the time, President Ronald Reagan, who changed the way that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, would be involved in cases of missing kids, but also murder cases. And today it's just commonplace. But back then it was very new, and it changed the way that the federal law enforcement officers were involved in such cases. So the sheriff's department is directly involved. This is the Sarpy Sheriff's Department in Sarpy County, Nebraska. But of course, we have the Bellevue Police Department that is the initial phone call that was made by the parents. And it was the Bellevue police chief, as I understand it, that said, you know what, we got to contact the local FBI field office here in Nebraska. Agents were immediately assigned to help with the search for the little boy, and it would at some point shift from a search to an investigation into the boy's disappearance. And a lot of that has to do with the circumstances of the boy's home life, school life. They found no problems, no reasons for him to run away. And immediately they started getting suspicious that this could be, and hopefully not, that it wouldn't turn out to be something exactly like the Johnny Gosch case. Now, keep in mind, this is almost exactly 1 year later. In fact, it's about 13 days beyond the 1 year anniversary that Johnny Gosch went missing from Des Moines, Iowa. And they had no clue as to where that little boy, where Johnny had gone. As we had stated, we have Special Agent in charge Herb Hawkins gets the call. He's running, I believe, 2 states at this time, and there's various investigations going on with that branch of the FBI at the time. So he's going to get his assistant special agent in charge, John Evans, to be the lead on this, which Evans was heavily involved in organized crime and other investigations typically conducted by the FBI. He wasn't so experienced in murder cases. And that's why they wanted to bring in somebody like Peter Clismet Jr., who had Quantico training. He had received the FBI profiler training courses. But he was still getting acclimated to that type of investigative work. Right. So he's still wet behind the ears here, Captain, when he gets this call. And in fact, in his book, he openly expresses saying, like, look, I feel like I've had the right training, that I was trained by some of the best, but I didn't feel like they're calling me an expert when I arrive on the scene. He goes, I didn't feel much like an expert arriving to the scene of a missing child case. He was very thankful that they also notified Quantico, wanting to bring in one of the big guns, as we had said yesterday, one of the original mine hunters, somebody that has done this before. But this was also going to be a bit of a transition period in Robert Ressler's FBI career as well. Now, the short of it is, sadly, Danny Joe Eberle was found. It was a short time later, just days later, that he was located, but he had obviously been murdered. So at the time of, it's the fall of 1983, Robert Ressler is at the Michigan State University. He's there to teach at an annual homicide seminar. Keep in mind, he's a graduate of Michigan State University. He says once he gets back to his hotel, mind you, it's 1983, so he's not walking around with a cell phone. Once he gets back to his hotel, the front desk hands him a message. And he said, as soon as I read it, it didn't need any explaining.
Right.
It just said, call the office immediately. Look, that means something has happened. It's something urgent, something ugly, something that will not wait. He makes the call, and that is when Robert Ressler was told about a young paper boy named Danny Joe Eberle that had been abducted and later found murdered in Bellevue, Nebraska, near Omaha. So they needed Ressler in Omaha to help identify the killer. He is going to be receiving this call and then en route to Omaha shortly after they find the body. In fact, by the time he gets there, they still have to wait for the autopsy results. Now, longtime listeners of this show know what it means when these cases, an abducted child, missing and then later found murdered. Our listeners know what it means when these cases are not handled with speed and coordination. There will be more victims. Ressler's initial reaction to being told as to what was going on there in Bellevue, Nebraska, he says, I couldn't help but think of the case that had already scarred the country's conscience. He says, almost precisely a year earlier in Des Moines, Johnny Gosch had vanished on a Sunday morning while delivering newspapers. He was never found. I, meaning Ressler, had spoken with Mr. and Mrs. Gosch, and I had heard the anger directly. The FBI had been slow to become involved. Ressler says technically the Bureau could point to jurisdiction being an obstacle. He said with no clear evidence that the crime crossed state lines, with no ransom note, there was no real federal hook there for them to become involved, especially right away. But he said, look, those type of technicalities do not comfort grieving parents.
Absolutely not. So in this case, we have Paperboy goes out, is abducted. We find his bike. The Johnny Gosch case, we find the wagon.
Mm-hmm.
But this case is different because we find a body. We don't find a body in the Johnny Gosch case. But in the Johnny Gosch case, we have a lot of eyewitnesses. Do we have any eyewitnesses in this case?
We do end up with some potential witnesses. So we don't get any witnesses to the actual abduction,
Right.
but we get some witnesses that might be able to provide some insights that could end up being a lead. Okay, so it was 2.5 days after what would later be known to everyone as an abduction that Danny Joe Eberle's body was found. And Ressler's brought in at that time once the body is found. And Ressler says at this time, we've talked about this plenty of times on the show, that at one point in his career, he and John Douglas are out busy doing what they called their road schools, going around and teaching different police departments and then assisting in cases if they happen to be there or via phone when they would get back to Quantico and then receive calls from a detective or a police chief that had something very strange, something very difficult to deal with. They would become involved, but they would do that remotely from Quantico. Ressler says up until about this time period in his career, so we're at 1983, he says much of his work had been conducted through phones, teletype, paperwork, and secondhand descriptions. This call puts him in Omaha, Nebraska, Bellevue, Nebraska, and this is a chance to be on the ground in the middle of an unfolding murder investigation called in. And what we will see is this will become more commonplace after an investigation like this, where you send an FBI or a team of FBI agents to another city to work a case.
Right.
He says this was stepping out of the classroom and onto the front line. So the Bellevue Police Headquarters, there had been a task force set up. It's already assembled by the time Ressler gets there. He says the building had the charged atmosphere of true urgency. Phones are ringing, voices are constant, people were moving quickly, information arriving faster than it could be absorbed and sorted through. He said Bellevue was the kind of suburb people imagined when they imagined stability. Modest incomes, routines, neighbors who assume their streets are safe and their children will come home. And of course, this case, a kid going missing and then later found dead, that normalcy was broken, was forever broken. Crimes like this don't just take a life, they puncture a community, and that community's belief that life is predictable. So let's go back just a couple days here, Captain, as you were asking, to the morning that Danny vanished. Before dawn on that Sunday morning, Danny Joe Eberle woke to start his route. He got dressed. Apparently everything except his shoes, which I found very odd because all reports state it was quite cold there that fall in 1983. But it's reported that he liked to go barefoot even when his parents told him not to. Danny did what he always did. He climbed onto his bicycle, pedaled to the local convenience store, picked up his stack of newspapers, started the folding process, and then went out to deliver them along his route. Danny was 13 years old, blondish, bright-eyed, about 5'2" tall, about 100 pounds. He's the son of a post office employee. His older brother delivered papers as well in that same neighborhood. And folks would say, seeing the Eberle boys out very early in the morning was usual. It was part of daily life. At 7 a.m., Danny's route supervisor began getting calls. Papers hadn't arrived. One missing paper might have been a delay, he thought. Several calls meant something else was going on. So the supervisor, in this case, we have the supervisor goes out to check. He's looking for Danny or for drop papers or something. Like, I would guess if your mother, father, or route supervisor, you're getting calls like this, if you're going out, what would you think would probably happen? Kid got into some kind of bicycle accident. Maybe he's laying there on the, side of the road or sidewalk somewhere or next to somebody's driveway, having wrecked his bike, gone over front of the handlebars, what have you. That's what this supervisor's looking for. He doesn't find Danny. So he calls the Eberle household. They're already receiving calls too about missing papers or undelivered papers. And the Eberle family says, we've gotten calls too. He's not home. Now, very quickly, what the parents and supervisor realized, the first 3 newspapers had in fact been delivered. So Danny did start his route as normal. He had made it to 3 houses, and then something happened after that 3rd delivery. And near what should have been the 4th drop, that's where they found Danny's bicycle propped up beside a fence. The remaining newspapers are still inside the bag. No signs of a struggle at this scene, though. No scattered papers or anything like that. No obvious disturbance. In fact, the bicycle looked like it was just propped up against a fence, like neatly, like the way that the owner, the carer of the person caring for the bike would set it in that manner.
Well, and this is just not commonplace either. It's if you have a paper route, it's every day, rain or shine, sleet or snow, you deliver the papers. But I'd say maybe once a year, there's a situation that the papers might be late, but you're not missing.
No. And the paper's late is almost always the kids overslept or the alarm didn't go off. Or in some cases, maybe the paper drop off, the bundle didn't show up on time.
Right. And what would happen as a paper boy is if they dropped off the papers late, you would contact your supervisor and they would tell you, well, deliver them if you can, but don't make yourself late for school. So if you can't deliver them in the morning, well, then right after school, deliver them then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the police were notified, as we had said earlier, very quickly. And in turn, they contacted the FBI's Omaha office. And those early hour searches by just a few people, it would grow very quickly to many people looking for this little boy. And of course, they're looking for explanation as to why that they can't find him, that do not require a predator to play out the equation, right? There was some brief talk or speculation that maybe Danny might have taken off. That theory was, as I understand it, quickly checked, quickly disproved, and they moved on from that.
Yeah, because it just, again, doesn't make a lot of sense. Deliver a couple papers and then decide to run away. This is too much for me today.
A massive building-to-building search began. Doors were knocked, yards are checked, streets are combed. Investigators and volunteers, again, we get a lot of volunteers in this search as well. They're hunting for anything, any trace of the little boy. They were looking for maybe somebody who had spotted someone talking to the boy. Maybe had somebody seen a car stop and talk to the kid while he's on his bicycle. They're not finding any of that. No leads really at all at this point. And I'll circle back to what you had asked in just a minute, but I want to get into this because, as we had said, it was just a couple days. That same week, Danny's body is found in high grass along a gravel road. This was just about 4 miles from where his bicycle was located, just a few miles from the Iowa state line. After arriving in Bellevue, Robert Ressler wanted to see the location where Danny's body was found. And he said he's standing there with Agent Klismet at his side. And he says, we could see the gravel road. This would be the obvious spot where a vehicle would stop. We could see how close the tall weeds were to the gravel road, how visible the site still was from the road, the major road, if a passerby looked carefully. Now, Ressler noted that there was a nearby crossroads and one road led to a river. And he said that raised questions immediately for him.
Right.
He said, look, if somebody put a body here, why not just go to the river where you would place the body in the water and it might drift off or be better concealed at least? Well,
and also destroy evidence.
Mm-hmm. And we get this expert mind there that is already informing local detectives of what he's seeing and what his experience is telling him about what they are finding. And he's telling the detectives right away, he's like, I think that the offender or offenders made that choice simply out of fear. You know, why not put them in the river? He said the person or persons dumping this body would have to be worried about headlights from other vehicles, about being seen, about being caught in the act, lit up by headlights, exposed. So he believed that the killers were in a hurry to leave the body and get out of this location unseen. The public was told Danny had been killed with a knife. That was technically true, but it really didn't explain the severity of what they found or the extent of what they found, which is not uncommon. They're not going to release all the details to the public. But Danny, in all reality, unfortunately, wasn't only killed, he was mutilated. He was found face down in the weeds. His hands and feet were tied behind his body, so behind his back with rope. His hands were taped as well, and there was tape covering his mouth. He had been stripped down to his undershorts. He had suffered multiple stab wounds to the chest and back. His neck had been slashed. There was a wound on his shoulder that looked as if a slice had been taken away. On his left, some reports say calf, but other reports say that it was up on the thigh area. there was some sort of crisscross pattern, almost like picture like a tic-tac-toe pattern that investigators found to be odd. And again, they wondered if this was something that was done post-mortem to cover up something else, to cover up some detail of the crime or the attack. And his face was battered. So he had been punched or beaten prior to being killed.
Yeah, it was a brutal mutilation. But it also makes me wonder, too, because, yes, you said he was 5'2", 100 pounds, probably soaking wet. Vulnerable situation because they're out on their own. But where are Paperboys? They're in neighborhoods. And normally neighborhoods have houses that are closer together. So there's more of a chance that somebody might see you, more of a chance that somebody might hear the abduction. But even though, like I said, he's small, he's a young boy, a responsible boy that's waking up every day to deliver papers. So there's a possibility that he's going to put up a fight. And then it makes you wonder, like what Wrestler was saying, well, why wouldn't you just dump him in the river? Is that because of fear, or is that because they didn't have a great concept of the location?
Well, and you asked about witnesses, and while we don't have any witnesses to the abduction or the placement of the body, what we do have is several witnesses who have accounts that tell police about experiences that they had that could be possibly connected to this murder case. And the one witness account that's going to stand out among the others is Danny's older brother. So Danny's older brother reported that on his own route, prior to his brother going missing, he believed that on more than one occasion, he had been tailed or followed by a young white male in a tan car. Now, that's the best description he could provide. But what we do get is other witnesses who come forward with even less details, but some of them believing that either they were being tailed by somebody similar description, or had seen a man in a vehicle trailing teenage boys from time to time, and some of them even describing it as watching them, pacing them.
Yeah, then I'd also want to know, if I'm law enforcement, has there been any suspicious activities in the weeks leading up to this abduction and murder?
Adobe Acrobat, your team's home base. Collaborate within a shared PDF space. You've got your docs, your plans, your specs, and then invite the crew to build what's next. They talk up the teamwork. Here's an updated render. They think that this design could be a contender. And when somebody wonders what's the next step, AI helps you finish the rest. Bolts are tight, now your plan's refined. Run a smoother business when you're all aligned. Do that with Acrobat. Learn more at adobe.com/do-that-with-Acrobat.
More cheese? Say less. The Applebee's OM Cheeseburger is back with even more cheese. So now you can get our juicy bacon cheeseburger served on a sizzling skillet of even more cheesy deliciousness. Dip your fries in more cheese. Dip your burger in more cheese. And dip your cheese in more cheese. Applebee's even cheesier OM Cheeseburger for $11.99. Also on our 2 for $25 menu.
Dine in only for a limited time. Price and participation varies. No substitutions. Offer valid per person per order.
All right, we are back. Cheers, mates. Cheers to you, Colonel.
Cheers to you, Captain. The best part about Peter Klismit's book, FBI Diary Profiles of Evil is in a case like this. So there are many cases that are discussed in that book, but when we're talking about the Danny Joe Eberle case, Klisman is talking about how he's pretty much receiving on-the-job training with Robert Ressler, working hand in hand with Robert Ressler on this particular homicide case. And he's also in a scenario where the local detectives are looking at him as being some kind of expert. And so this task force made up of these FBI agents and detectives are working together really with Robert Ressler, the mine hunter, being the lead and teaching as he's investigating the case as well. After the body's found, we already discussed the injuries, the mutilation to our victim here. The FBI, everybody involved have already been to the crime scene. Now they're back at the headquarters and they're looking at photographs that were taken from that crime scene, photographs of the victim and how he was found. Robert Ressler pointed at the ropes on the boy's wrist and ankles saying, quote, "People with sadistic inclinations tend to want to completely immobilize their victim. It gives them a feeling of control, power over their victim, and it lets him do exactly what he wants without any resistance," end quote. Now, this might seem to our listeners who have been in the garage looking at these cases for years now as an obvious statement. In 1983, to some of these detectives that are there working this case, it's not such an obvious statement. It's actually an education. And he told these detectives, he says, "Here's what I want you to do. I want to understand how this happened." He says, "And I definitely know what happened, but I want to understand why and how this happened." And that was not such a big portion of any murder investigation at this department at this time. They were always so worried about what happened, right? He's letting them know if you can concern yourself and figure out how it happened and why it happened, that might tell you who did this.
Right.
So he's putting emphasis on the ideas of we know who it happened to and where the body of the boy was found. What we need to know is why all of these things happen. So he tells the agent, he tells the detectives, all right, here is what I want you guys to do. Every one of you has a good understanding of the case, but I want to know, why did this guy do what he did? Did he take a big risk when he grabbed the boy off the street? If he did, what does that tell you? Did he have to use physical force on the boy, or did he have a weapon with him?
Right.
What does that tell us?
Right. Where he doesn't have to use the weapon. He's using the weapon as a threat.
How long did he keep the boy?
Well, I'm going to our standby, round up the perverts.
Yeah. And one detail that we did go through, he says to his team, look, apparently there wasn't any sex involved, no rape involved, sexual assault involved. But Ressler believes, look, that doesn't mean that it's not sexual in nature, that the crime isn't sexually motivated. And he's asking these guys, are we looking at a crime that was impulsive, spur of the moment, or did this guy do some prior planning?
Yeah, like I said, what was happening in the weeks before the abduction, but it could be a little bit of both. This individual is heading to work or heading home from work, or heading home from the bar, sees this paper boy, just notices, sees him multiple times, maybe follows him a little bit on one of the times, and then starts getting these ideas. Or is this somebody that's from a whole different location and not local to the crime?
Well, and the light bulb is going off for these detectives that are essentially learning at the foot of Robert Ressler. And he says to him, he goes, look, maybe he didn't tie the boy up this way for complete control or domination. Maybe he did. But if he didn't tie him up that way for complete control and domination, then why did he do it? Why did he tie him up that way? He's essentially hogtied. And Peter Klisman says, that was a pivotal moment for his career and for him being a young FBI profiler, to think a little bit differently when you're looking at a crime scene, when you're looking at a victim. And immediately he says to Ressler, he goes, maybe this killer used that because it was something familiar to him. Maybe he grew up on a farm. Maybe he was used to, doing this. Maybe he had experience slaughtering animals.
Well, we've talked about this before too. If you have certain bindings, does that make it easier to move the body?
Exactly. There is a reason why most of these things happen, why the killer or killers made certain choices. There's not always an absolute reason. It's not always all well thought out, but most of the time there's a reason why somebody chose something over other options. So simply, why did the killer do what he did at any given point? Wrestler tells the guys that is, if we can figure that out, that's going to give us some serious clues into the motivation behind this guy, what motivated this guy and who he is. Now, the medical examiner's report suggested Danny might have been kept alive for as much as a day after his abduction and killed close to the time when his body was eventually discovered. And as we said, there was no sexual assault in the usual sense, as it was put by the detectives on this case. I want to circle back to the, because we have the benefit of knowing some of the future events and results of this investigation. That whole statement of that Danny might have been kept alive for as much as a day or killed very close to the time of when his body was discovered, the later reports suggest something completely different. And actually it falls into the statistics, the unfortunate statistics that we know, that oftentimes a young victim, especially if it's a child abduction, when murdered, it's relatively quickly after the abduction. So they kind of go back and forth. When you examine the entirety of this investigation, they're really all over the shop on their idea of, well, was he killed quickly? Was he kept for a couple days? Was he killed right before he was found? They kind of go all around on that idea. And I don't think they ever really came up with a great understanding of that. Now,
well, like you said, though, this is extreme violence. And then you have to question, was this done post-mortem or not? And then I think that plays into the psychology too. Was this victim similar to the killer? And was that the reason for the extreme violence? Or was this victim some kind of representation of something negative in this killer's world, if that makes any sense?
Well, and we don't get a great breakdown of what they determined to be post-mortem wounds.
I'm guessing that's a little bit to do with just the lack of technology.
Yes, or if they do know that, they've chose not to release some or most of that information to the public. One thing that kind of cracked me up here when reviewing this case and going through all of Robert Ressler's information on this case, again, it's the time frame, right? 1983. And he says that when he's there collecting information at the crime scene and about the victim and the wounds to the victim, he says he's putting all of that into VICAP computer. We've talked about VICAP system on the show many times, but he's saying because of technology at the time and because of the limited resources at the time, he's not actually plugging it into the VICAP computer. He goes, I'm putting this information into the VICAP computer in my head. He said, I'm comparing this case and what I'm seeing here to all the other cases that I've worked, some that have similarities and some that don't, and trying to figure out what have I learned in those previous cases that I can apply to this case. Because as said, he says this right away, and our listeners know this. You get a call like this, you know that there's a very high chance that there's going to be a future victim or future victims. So you are working not just against the clock of a typical murder investigation, but you are working against the clock of when, if this guy does act again or these people act again, when will that be?
Right.
And I got to beat that clock.
Well, because what we've heard so often is when these people kill, an individual, especially if it's the first time. They kill the individual and they think that the cops are going to rain down on them right away, and that doesn't happen. And they go through this time period where they're a little scared that they might get caught, and then that wears off. But that seems to wear off faster the more victims that this killer has.
Well, and the information that we talked about with the other boys saying that they thought they had been followed or thought they may have seen somebody following a boy, that information must have carried a lot of weight with Agent Wrestler, because within just a day or about 36 hours of him arriving on the scene, he starts to put together a preliminary profile of the likely offender or offenders. And that information is part of his profile. So his initial profile reads as such, saying, I, Robert Wrestler, believe the killer is a young white male, likely in his late teens or early 20s. The body dump looked risky and imperfect, suggesting inexperience. He says the offender likely had access to a vehicle and a license, but the crime did not show the practiced competence associated with a seasoned offender. He says, I think it's possible the killer may have known Danny, but only casually. He may have known him enough to approach him without triggering any type of alarm. And he could have talked him into a vehicle voluntarily, or he says a car or possibly a van. He also says at this stage, he could not rule out multiple offenders or the possibility of more than one offender. He said if it is more than one, he would believe that it would be all young males to be involved. No more than 3 total. He also said, in considering a sexual motive, he says perhaps an attempted assault was met with resistance, but he did state that the absence of defensive wounds complicated this picture, or that being likely. He said that the body's disposal suggested panic, remote but not carefully concealed, as if the offender needed the body gone quickly rather than to be hidden well. He also states that the bindings mattered. The ropes and tape indicated control, but the overall event suggested partial planning mixed with improvisation.
Yeah, I don't know how much they released on these bindings, but I'd want to know, are they consistent with each other?
He says that he suspects that the offender is local, likely single, not educated beyond high school, possibly in menial work or unemployed. The rope work suggested someone used to tying and handling practical materials. So tying knots or experience with rope, and maybe specifically this type of rope.
Well, location matters. And so thinking that it's local, that makes sense to me because of the time period, because this individual either had to stay up and stay awake for this time period, or they had to wake up early. And like we said, if we believe that these other Paperboys were saying that, hey, I had a situation where I thought somebody was following me, if we think those are connected, again, that's multiple times that the person is either staying up or getting up early. And then it would also make you wonder what kind of shift, if this person had a job, what kind of shift were they working? Were they a first shift employee? Were they a second shift employee? Because then you could go, was the panic for the disposal of the body because they're afraid they're going to get caught, or is the panic because they have to get somewhere? And whether that, now Wrestler said he believed that this person was probably single, but it's like, did he have to get somewhere to go to work, or did he have to get somewhere to go back to be with his family? Or it could be an individual that's living, like a late teen, early 20s guy living with his family, and to go, well, if I'm not back by the time everybody wakes up, they're going to be suspicious of what I'm doing.
Well, and for look, I understand that sometimes these likely offender profiles are not very satisfying, or in some
love
cases,
them.
not very detailed. But what I think is so fascinating about this particular profile is, as we said, by this point, when he's delivering this profile, this is him telling the detectives that are going to be working this case. This is him telling the police chief, the sheriff, the people in power, not some deputies, not some beat cops, not the newspaper, not the parents. And this is not some, you're looking for a single white male and he's a loner.
Right.
It's not that. This is pretty detailed information. In fact, it's over a page long, and he's delivering this within 36 to 48 hours at most after having arrived on the scene. I mean, the case is completely new to him until he steps off that airplane.
Right. But sometimes you just have to jot down these notes and thoughts in the moment, and you can then go back and edit later.
Well, true. I mean, like John Douglas says, that a profile is living, breathing. It can be altered and should be altered when new information or better information is found. But in this case, as said, he's there a day and a half and delivering this information to the people that will be working the case, the police and the sheriff's department. And I'm not done with the profile. He goes on to say that,
continue, please.
He says, one detail remains central to the case. The boy stripped to his undershorts without conventional sexual assault. He says, in my experience, that combination often pointed to a young male offender with little genuine sexual experience, someone driven toward domination, humiliation, and fantasy rather than adult sexual completion.
Right.
He says the mutilation on the victim suggests deviant fantasies that didn't erupt suddenly. He says the offender likely had chronic sexual problems, a history of deviancy, and might be an avid consumer of pornography. The offender might have experienced recent stress, such as a breakup, job loss, being dropped from school, family trouble, and might have been absent from work for days before or after the crime.
Right.
The abduction's early hour suggests a person not accountable to a spouse or attentive household. That's a long way of saying this guy lives alone. And he goes on to say, sometimes offenders act early after being awake all night drinking, building courage. He also talked about what he referred to as something that every investigator learns the hard way. He says the abduction site is often not the murder site, and the murder site is often not where the body is found. He says the place where the body is discovered becomes the crime scene because it yields the most evidence. But the mechanics of the abduction and the killing remain hidden. He says in Danny's case, he believed that the victim was killed elsewhere and dumped near the river, and he also warned the investigators about offender behavior that he said he had seen before. He said the killer might insert himself into the investigation, hovering around the dump area, going to the funeral, going to the gravesite, going to the neighborhood, seeking proximity and information. Somebody that wants to be close to the investigation, somebody that wants to know what the investigators know or what they don't know. And he advised that the artist conceptions should not be made public. So this is interesting because in the Gosch case, we have that composite sketch that they choose to hold back based off that they didn't know how accurate it would be, but they eventually release it to the public.
Right.
Here, what Ressler's saying is what I think it means. I'm kind of reading between the lines here, Captain, is I think what he's saying is, you know, those witness reports of some guy, a young man in a vehicle following other kids. He's putting a lot of weight and credibility into those statements. And so much so that they put together a composite sketch, or started to build one at the very least. He's saying two things. Don't release my profile to the public, and don't release a composite sketch yet to the public. He said, because the chance that the killer or killers would want to insert themselves into the investigation, you need to give them time to come forward. that if you do this now,
it could scare them off.
yes, he's forewarned that he might be recognized.
Well, and I know we bring up the Delphi case a lot, but it's like if you hold certain things back, then even though this perpetrator or killer might insert themselves, they might insert themselves again. Because when you hold back, the more evidence that you hold back, the bigger the question mark is to the killer of what do they know and what don't they know.
Mm-hmm.
And then what you were saying is like, well, he's not killed in the location that he was disposed of. So, but that, what makes me wonder then, well, is the crime scene inside of a vehicle, a car, van, creepy camper, truck?
Well, you mean the murder scene, because what we're going to have here is something we've talked about plenty of times, multiple crime scenes, right? The crime scene is going to be where the kid was when he was abducted,
right?
Whether that was violently or not violently, the vehicle used to transport him from the abduction site. And if he was killed anywhere other than that vehicle, now we have an additional crime scene, and whatever vehicle moved him from where he was killed to where he was found. So multiple crime scenes. And what I love about when Douglas and when Ressler are able to provide law enforcement with such a detailed profile of the likely offender, that they don't just give them that, oh, here's my profile, this is the guy that you're looking for. They usually give them some strategy, some things that they can use to either find the guy, locate the guy, figure out who it is,
or draw them out.
Things that they could use during the course of their investigation that would be to their advantage later. So like one item would be, don't release the composite sketch, don't release my profile yet, give him a chance to come forward and talk to you. Give him a chance to come forward and insert himself into the investigation. Now here, he also said, so in Bellevue, one of the big things that you have in Bellevue is an Air Force base. Ressler told the task force two things. He goes, I think the rope is extremely important. He goes, I don't know this, but I believe the rope to be unique, to be rare. And if it is, if you figure out where that rope came from, you might be able to find your guy. He said, at the very least, if you can find more of that rope with somebody, then that's probably your guy.
Right.
And then two, he also told them that he thought the Air Force base had very much to do with the offender. And he told them, he said, you need to start going back through the records and find out who arrived here within the last 6 months, who got transferred here, who started working there within the last 6 months. He told them, he goes, I really think, he goes, I don't know what that number will be. That's for you guys to sort out. It could be a few people, it could be hundreds of people. He goes, but I think you're going to find the guy in that list, on that list.
Well, what would that base have? It would have males in the age range that Ressler was looking for. So you go in there, you line them all up, you have them drop their pants, you look for a bruised banana, you look for all the perverts, and you go, okay, let's question these guys.
Yeah, I think one of the problems became here that number of transfers or airmen coming into that base was a significant number within the last 6 months. The other thing, because what you would think to do, and what wasn't done early on in the Long Island investigation, the Long Island serial killer investigation, that seemed to be the big break in the case, that seemed to be the moment too, where everybody goes, oh, really? That's what they did? That's how they found the guy? Why didn't they do that to start with? You know, in that case, you had a couple things to cross-reference. You knew a general area where he had gone to pick up one of the victims, and that a male, a very large male, was described to police as being a John, and that very large male drove a unique vehicle.
Yeah.
And really the big break in that case was after other investigators and better investigators took over that case. They went back to that idea and said, you know what, how about we just to check a box, even if it's not, let's run down this lead and see if it's something or nothing. Let's find a really big guy that owns a unique truck. Right. And they did. And it turns out that was their killer. Now here, allegedly, we have to say, right? He's not been convicted.
Well, I mean,
he will.
Look,
be, I mean.
Well, they're suspecting that he's going to plead guilty. So to 7 of the murders.
In this case, you have more than one. I would like to know if those kids, those teenagers, were all describing and giving a very similar description of the vehicle, of the young white male in the tan car tailing kids. Because if they're giving a very similar description, and you're hearing it time and time again, oh, it's a 4-door vehicle, it's a sedan, it's a, don't know what model it is, but it might be this make or that make. You have, like you said, the age range of the majority of the folks at that Air Force base are going to be in the age range of Ressler's likely offender. Now you have a tan vehicle. You could cross-reference that information and go, well, even though we've had hundreds, if not a couple thousand people in and out in the last 6 months, how many of them had a vehicle that matched that description or access to a vehicle that matched that description?
Yeah. And I think Ressler is a genius. I think John Douglas is a genius. Though the only thing here is when he talks about a transfer, I understand where he's coming from, because the idea is, one, why were they transferred? Was it for some deviant reason? So, it wouldn't be the first time that the military, swept under the rug an evil individual. But where I would kind of go against this idea, and it might be somebody that's been there longer, is we don't know how, because he said inexperience. So if there is inexperience, how long did the escalation take to go from curious mind to killer? And what I mean by that is, okay, well, I went out drinking, so now I drive around a little bit. Oh, I spotted some Paperboys out on their routes. Then at some point, now I'm following them, right? And what's the escalation? And then also, no brainer. Did any of these individuals feel threatened, or was there any action other than being followed take place?
Yeah, other than one version of a story where the male may have got out of the vehicle, I don't recall there being anything other than kids being suspicious of seeing a car. Because here's the deal. Look, you're on a bike or you're walking, you're not traveling very fast. Cars are much faster than bicycles and people walking. Bipeds, as they call them.
Yeah. Depends on who's riding the bike, though.
I guess it depends on the clunker too. But
yeah.
I think what would be obvious, these are teenagers, these are kids that are not toddlers. I think can be fairly obvious when a car is tailing someone on a bicycle, especially somebody walking.
Right.
You would have to be traveling at a very low rate of speed. And then to circle back to what you had just mentioned about the deviant behavior. Okay. So that's part of the profile that's interesting, and where I think you have to read between the lines. And I don't think Ressler made any of these detectives read between the lines, because he's there to catch this guy and catch him with the quickness. So part of that profile says the mutilation suggested the deviant fantasies didn't erupt suddenly, meaning they had been there for a long period of time. He said the offender likely had chronic sexual problems, a history of deviancy, and might be an avid consumer of pornography. And then goes on to say the offender might have experienced recent stress, breakups, job loss, and so on, family trouble. What he's saying is, even though his profile, he's telling you that this guy lives alone, he's not, what you would be looking for is somebody that at some point lived with this guy. Or if he is somebody that lives on the Air Force base, he likely has a roommate. And this is behavior that would be recognized by somebody that lived with this offender at one time.
Yeah, which, again, if you're on this base, your superiors have the right to check your property. And if you have a roommate that won't stop molesting himself, this might have been reported to the higher ups.
Yes, and we're looking for a knife that the killer may have kept. We're also looking for additional rope that matches the bindings on our victim. The evidence that was collected at the body discovery scene, of course, was sent off to the lab for testing. The rope is going to be something that they will be testing. The immediate response and findings was that the rope that was analyzed did not match like known samples that they had on hand. They couldn't. So the scientific findings were lining up with Ressler's suspicions that the rope could be unique, that it was possibly rare. And again, that's going to be key evidence in your investigation. We do know that Danny's older brother and some of those other witnesses were hypnotized. A hypnosis team was brought in from Texas to hypnotize these witnesses to try to recover additional details, but the report is little new information emerged from that technique. And eventually, Robert Ressler returned to Quantico, and eventually Agent Klismet returned to Iowa while the task force continued their work looking for the killer of Danny Joe Eberle. But it was in early December when Robert Ressler was in the state of Alabama. He was doing some teaching in Alabama. He receives a second call related to this homicide. This time it is a call from the assistant agent in charge. We mentioned his name prior, Captain. His name's John Evans. And John Evans is reporting to Robert Ressler that another boy had been abducted again near Omaha, Nebraska. And the fear that Robert Ressler warned the task force about, that the killer of Danny Joe Eberle, that he will do it again, seemingly had now become fact.
I want to thank everybody for joining us here in the garage for this series, Missing Paperboys. Thanks for telling your mother. Thanks for telling your brother. And join us back here in the garage for the conclusion of this series next week.
And until then, be good, be kind,